Good evening and welcome to Maynard High School. Before we begin our program, An Evening with Fernando Reimers, I'd like to acknowledge some very special contributors to this event. First and foremost, I need to thank my school committee, the school committee of Maynard, for desiring a strategic planning process that includes really incredible and innovative events like this, aggressively looking at the best practices in education internationally and locally. And many of my school committee members who wanted to attend right now, I'd like to introduce Reimers, who's one who was able to attend tonight. She's here. And I'd just like to thank them all for really promoting this and the many other events we've been doing. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge Principal Karajanis and his staff, including our custodians, our food service vendors, Whitsons, for making our accommodations comfortable and rewarding tonight. Third, I'd like to identify that this is a trilogy of events. And we've been sharing our communities of Concord, Carlisle, Lincoln, Sudbury, and Maynard. We've already had 2 prior events in their communities, and this is the 3rd event. So I really need to thank my colleagues, Diana Rigby and Bella Wong, who really instituted this, got it started. It's great that we're doing this together. Penultimately, I'd like to thank our staff and families from all the communities, and without you, none of this would be possible. Ultimately, I'd like to thank a specific educator extraordinaire. He's a retired superintendent, a current school committee member, a professional mentor to many of us superintendents in his roles in the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents. And he's here tonight. It's Tony Beck, who's here for this magnanimous event. Now, let me introduce our guest this evening. You probably read that he's the Harvard Graduate School Ford Foundation Professor of Practice of International Studies. That title represents a long and illustrious career in education, but his expertise is in the contributions of educational policy and innovation in the development of 21st century skills, educational leadership, and global learning. I've had the good fortune to see several of his presentations in the past. Every time they're extremely unique and extremely relevant. It's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Fernando Reimers.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this kind introduction. Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all very much for coming tonight. Before I get going with my presentation, let me explain to you how it is that I came to be interested in the question of what are the competencies that young people need in the 21st century. For most of my career, I've been interested in how it is that schools and education can empower poor kids. And for a long time, what that meant to me was how do we make sure that kids go to school and they stay in school for as long as possible, and maybe they go to college. And a couple of events caused me to change my mind about that. One of them was 9/11. In 9/11, I had done work early in my career in Pakistan. I'd written a book about education in Pakistan. I interviewed teachers, I had a team that interviewed teachers in 500 schools, and I thought I knew Pakistan really well. I spent 3 years of my life working there. And when 9/11 happened, and the newspapers described the profiles of the 19 hijackers, a number of them had gone to school in Pakistan, probably at the time when I was doing my research there, between 1988 and 1991. And I couldn't have seen that coming. I could not have imagined that these individuals, all of whom had some college education, so by world standards, they were very privileged. A very small percentage of the world's population never makes it past high school, would have used their talent to basically inflict harm on civilians not engaged in combat. And so that caused me to ask myself, what did I miss? What did I not see coming? And so that and other events in the world caused me to begin to pay attention to citizenship education. What is it that equips people to be active citizens, engaged citizens, contributing members of the communities of which they are a part? And so I did a number of things in that domain, and I spent about 8 years of my life doing that kind of work. And I was, about 7 years ago, doing a study of a program created by former students of mine. I direct a master's program in international education at the Graduate School of Education, where students go on to expand educational opportunity around the world. And this particular group of students had created a teacher professional development organization in Mexico to help teachers implement a civic education program. Their civic education program was really a youth leadership development program. It basically taught the teachers how to engage their students in identifying a problem in the community, deciding, negotiating amongst themselves what problems they were going to work on, and then spend a year identifying the root causes of the problem and do something about the problem. And so I wanted to know what kind of impact that program had. So I'm going to give you one vignette of the kinds of things that I saw. Picture a school in southern Mexico, in the state of Guerrero, fairly rural, fairly indigenous, where they had no water. They had latrines but no water. And so the kids decided that they had to bring water to the school. And I asked the kids, why is that important? They said, well, no one wants to be in a school that has no water, but this is a particularly serious problem for girls. So at this age, girls are menstruating, and you don't really want to be in a school that has no water when you have your period. And you miss your class 3 days or 5 a month, every month, you're going to miss your grade. You're going to have to repeat the grade and repeat it again and repeat it again, and you're eventually going to drop out. And so these young people basically figured out, what can we do about this problem? And they found that 2 houses down, there was a lady who had a well in her house. And they said, could we get water an hour a day from your place? And she said, yeah, but you're going to have to get it to the school, which they did. They raised money to get a little pump. They built some provisional hoses, and they got the water to the school. They were pretty proud. They then invited the local mayor, who of course showed up in the school to take his picture with the kids. And then they said, Mr. Mayor, we want you to know something. We want you to know that we know we have a right to have clean water in this school. And we have solved the problem, but this is not a very permanent solution. Now we're hoping, since you came, we're hoping we're going to work together to make this a more permanent solution. So that is what the program was about. So I'm studying that kind of program, doing an experimental evaluation of this thing. If you're interested, you can find the paper on my website. A program of that sort really has a huge impact in how kids think about themselves, in their ability to develop goals for themselves, to develop the confidence that they can achieve their goals, to understand that to achieve their goals they're going to have to work with other people, to develop very different notions of gender equity, to discover that women and men have the same capacity to work together in solving their problems. So I'm doing that research when I'm in a meeting in the Middle East, and I meet this phenomenal woman who has taken a program of a very different sort to teach high school kids how to create businesses. Her name was Soraya Salti. And I'm describing this research that I'm doing, which I'm really very excited about. And she says, you know, I'm trying to do the same thing in my programs, except that where I work, I cannot call that democratic civic education, I call it entrepreneurship education. But it's the same idea. And I said, really? He said, yeah. And in fact, it's shorter. I bring a mentor from the business community to the school, and they work with a group of kids, and they teach them how to create a business. And they do that in a period of 3 months, where they go from ideating the product, building the company, raising the capital, marketing the thing, and eventually liquidating the company. And she challenged me. She said, why don't you study my program? I said, well, only if I can use the same instruments I'm using in Mexico, if I can ask the kids the same question. And I could ask all the same questions except their views on religion. That was very sensitive in the 6 countries in which I did that experiment, which were Lebanon, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, and Egypt, and there was one other country. And to my surprise, I found that Soraya was right, that her program had some of the very same effects I was finding in Mexico. And so that taught me something. Things are so obvious once you discover them that you wonder how come you hadn't seen that earlier, right? It was like when I discovered that education wasn't just about getting kids to spend more years in school, but it was about what they were doing in school and what they were deciding to use their talent for. And so I realized that underneath different kinds of curricula, there is potentially a common DNA, and it is that DNA that defines whether a pedagogy is empowering to kids or not. And some people may call the curriculum entrepreneurship education, others may call it youth leadership, others may call it science education, engineering. But if you open the cover of the book and you look underneath, you find a lot of common elements in terms of what is this program doing to develop the agency of the kid? What is this program doing to develop the belief that they can achieve their goals? What is it doing to develop the capacities to work with other people? So then I decided that I wanted to study that DNA, and I put together a group of colleagues in China, Singapore, India, Chile, Mexico, the US, and we just added Colombia, where our mission is to try to figure out that DNA. So we've just published a book that is the first in a series. So this initiative basically has three legs. One leg is a research leg. We're going to decode this DNA. And the first thing we did was to spend some time reading everything we could get our hands on what are the competencies of the 21st century. And I'm now agnostic as to whether people call these civic education or science education. All I care about is what is it that the kids should know that would help them become architects of their own lives and contributing members of their communities. And so we synthesized that research and developed a little taxonomy. I'm going to talk about that taxonomy tonight. And then use that to analyze the national curriculum frameworks of the countries I have mentioned, including the Common Core. And then we wrote a series of case studies where we interviewed the key policy actors that were responsible for the priorities of the curriculum in those nations. And so that's the story we tell on the book, Teaching and Learning in the 21st Century. One of the conclusions of that book was that the linchpin of 21st century education actually is no longer the curriculum, because there are more similarities in the curriculum frameworks of those countries than I had expected to find, and I think that my colleagues had expected to find. But what there is a huge gap between aspirations and practice. And the linchpin to close that gap are the opportunities to help teachers develop really deep capacities to create pedagogies that help their students develop as well-rounded human beings, individuals. And so we're now doing research on programs that have good evidence and a good reputation that they actually do those things in the same countries. And we're in the middle of that research, more than a middle. That'll be the next book, and we hope it'll be done by the end of the year, basically finding what are the commonalities between excellent teacher professional development programs in these nations. And then we're going to do another look at what does this look like in the classroom, what does the pedagogy look like, and so on. So that's the research leg of the enterprise. There are the two legs, which are one is basically connecting with groups that are interested in this. I have found since I began to do this work that in fact there are tons of educators interested in doing that. They're under the radar. You don't hear very much about them because all we hear about are standards and assessments and things like PISA. But if you look, if you open the cover, you find that these people exist. And we're trying to develop connections with them and connect with existing platforms and build some platforms. So I was just 2 weeks ago in Dubai at a big global education conference that we're now collaborating with, trying to use that conference as a platform to bring some of these educators together. And I'm happy to tell you more about that. And then the third leg of that stool is one where once we decode enough of that DNA, we're going to have to figure out how do we take these ideas to scale? How do we connect with individuals who have the means to bring some of these programs at scale so that we all get a lot better at what we're trying to do faster. So, I learned that if you open the cover, there are a lot of common things, and that what is really important is to understand what is the DNA of 21st century education. And so I wanted to give you that background just to help you understand why am I interested in what I'm going to share with you. So let me get going with my talk. I'll have to come back and forth. Let me see if I can get this to work. Here it is. And so, oops. What happened here? So that's not the slide we should have here. Let me just see. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, this is the slide. So let me first ask you whether you are happy. Would you raise your hand if you would say that you're happy? And if you are not, please don't raise your hand. So you're pretty happy. Wow. That's probably why you're here on a Wednesday night. I should be so lucky to have a happy crowd. But, you know, to some extent, it's a good thing that you're happy. And it's a good thing to know that you're in fairly good company. There is a survey that is given to representative samples of the adult population in about 60 different countries around the world every 7 years. And those people are asked a bunch of questions, including the question, are you happy? So it's a really nice instrument to see how do countries compare. And I'm going to draw on that survey. This survey is called the World Values Survey. I'm going to draw on that survey with a few slides tonight. But the first one is the slide that presents the results of that question, are you happy? So for the US, 39% of the population is very happy. Now, I didn't ask you whether you were very happy or rather happy, but if you add those two up for the US, what you see is that about 90% Americans consider themselves rather happy or very happy. We have 10% people who are unhappy. Swedes are a little bit happier than we are. People in Malaysia are a little bit happier. People in India are a little bit less happy than we are. For the most part, people are happy. Most people are happy around the world. Now, in this country was created to make it possible for people to pursue their happiness, right? To be happy. This is why we decided we wanted to be an independent place. And we figured that, the reason that we concluded that is because there was a very powerful idea that was at the root of the creation of this experiment, which was the idea that ordinary people could rule their lives. People hadn't always had that idea. A bunch of philosophers in places ranging from France to Scotland, including people like Adam Smith in Scotland and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was Swiss but who was working in France, were part of this philosophical movement called the Enlightenment that basically said, we should replace the aspiration that we live for salvation. That is, that we have to endure suffering in this world so that we can be happy in the afterlife, and replace that with the aspiration that we can actually be happy in these lives, and that ordinary people have the means to make themselves happy. And so this project, this philosophical project, suggested that people had the means to transform the world, had the capacity, and reason was that capacity, to transform the world, and that one could construct a society that made it possible for people to pursue their happiness. And so this was one of the experiments. So were all the other democracies that sprung around the world inspired by that idea. The second institution that was inspired by that idea, of course, were public schools. Because once we had this great faith that human reason provided us the tools to come along with others, to improve ourselves and our communities, then we had to figure a way to give every person the opportunity to develop that powerful tool. And public schools were the institution invented to do that, here in America and in other places. And so there are some elements of that project that I think I want to bring up today. And one of them is, this contract that was built so that people could be happy included accepting the notion that people should be happy in a way that reflects who they are, and that we're all different. And that in that difference, there is beauty, there's a strength. And so one of the dimensions of difference, there are many, concerns religious creed. And so this notion that religious freedom was important, that we better learn to get along across religious differences, because that is what would enable us to come together and improve our communities, was central to the American experiment. I'm sure you're aware of the letter of the correspondence between George Washington and Moses Sextus. Moses Sextus was a Jew in Lisbon. He was the head of the Jewish congregation in Newport, in Rhode Island. His father was an immigrant. His father was born in Lisbon, gone to London and then here. And when George Washington came to visit Rhode Island, which, as you remember, was one of the last provinces to ratify the US Constitution, he was greeted by a number of groups. And Moses Sextus wrote him a letter welcoming him on behalf of the congregation. And that exchange between Washington and Sextus is an exchange that talks about the importance of religious freedom to this experiment. Essentially, Washington tells him, he makes a number of biblical references that allude to the persecution experienced by Jewish people, and he tells them, in this country, we have room for everybody, and each one can practice their faith as they please, and provided they're a good citizen, and we come together to improve this kind of new society that we're building. It's important that we should remind ourselves that, particularly in the current presidential debate, where people seem to have forgotten that the contract in which this experiment was built was a contract of acceptance, of difference, of diversity, and that in that difference lay a great strength that we have. So, anyway, to bigotry no sanction is what Washington said, and to prosecution or to persecution no assistance. So, to be happy is an important piece of this project. Benjamin Franklin was another one of the intellectuals of the Enlightenment, and in many ways, a perfect example, right? The only self-made founding father in many ways, who embodied politics and who built all kinds of institutions. He didn't see a problem that he thought needed fixing, that he didn't get a group of friends and say, why don't we go and fix it ourselves? And Franklin is relevant because, like my former students who created a program to teach teachers in Mexico how to empower their students to improve their communities, and like Soraya Salti, who did the same thing in 13 different countries in the Middle East, created a program to empower youth. He's a perfect example of the empowered individual, the ordinary person who has tremendous agency and who exemplifies what it means to be a doer. And so I'm going to talk about the creation of the public school. So you recognize these two people? Who are they? So if I tell you on the left, on the right is Horace Mann, who's on the left? What's that? That's right, Mary Peabody Mann, his wife. Elizabeth was a sister, there were 3 sisters. Elizabeth was important in the preschool movement, but this is Mary Peabody Mann, Horace's wife. I'm sure that she deserves at least half of the credit for the ideas of the public school at the time. Both extremely influential individuals in taking this idea that we actually have to build institutions like these to empower ordinary people so they could become architects of their own lives. And it's good to remind ourselves that the reason they built those schools is so that we could have a democracy. The argument that Horace Mann made for the public school was that we should create schools so that we could help. Remember, he was living 1850s at a time of the 3rd largest wave of immigration in this nation, when people from all walks of life, different countries and so on, were coming together and says, we're going to have to figure out a way to work together. We're going to have to figure out a way to work across those lines of difference, because we need everybody if we're going to make this society, this experiment, succeed. And that's why he made his case for the public school. And so here are other founders. I recently saw this film, which I recommend, Brooklyn. Now it's situated in the 1950s, not in the beginning of the 1900s, but it's a story. It's a story that as an immigrant I identify with, of why do many people come to this country? As a way to find the opportunity to define yourself. You know, this continues to be the place where you can write your history, where your history isn't going to be written by who your parents are or what walk of life you come, but you're going to make your own history. It's a great movie. But our public schools really existed. So you have here Jane Addams on the left, you know who she was, the founder of social work, a phenomenal woman who, one of the first American to receive a Nobel Peace Prize, I think the first Nobel Peace Prize recipient, because she did work, she could see the connections between 3 strands of work. Advancing the political rights of women, on the one hand, advancing the educational opportunities of poor kids and immigrant kids, and so basically those were the 3, and she was a great peace advocate. So it was peace, political, voice for women, and educating, and for that reason, and she did a lot of things in terms of creating institutions and so on. She was one of the main figures of the progressive movement in America. The person to her right was John Dewey, an educator who worked at Columbia at a time when Columbia University had created really the first teacher education university program in this country. And that program was created because the country is in the midst of this big wave of immigrants, and the presidents of Columbia recognized they're going to have to prepare educators who teach a different kind of kid, the kind of kid that Jane Addams was interested in, poor, and many of them immigrants and children of immigrants, and they thought, this is a different kind of undertaking than what we have been teaching in the past, and so maybe we could learn something from looking outside the US. If we prepare these teachers with some knowledge about what's going on elsewhere, this is going to produce a certain flexibility that would help them invent a pedagogy that will empower these kids. Anyway, so this is all context for why we have schools, why we have created public schools. It's helpful to remember that public schools are relatively recent. 1850s, which is when we built them here, it's yesterday. In historical terms, it's yesterday. It's nothing of a time. For most of the world, the opportunity to go to school is even more recent. He is the product of another great social activist, Eleanor Roosevelt, who basically after World War II got together a group of people in a room, not like this one, it was the San Francisco Opera House, and she got them to say, how do we make sure we have peace in the world? And she said, well, we will have peace in the world if we can come to agreement as to what are the basic rights that every human has, simply because they are human. And they crafted this little document. And one of those rights, Article 26, it has only 30 articles. It's beautiful. If you read it, it's worth rereading. I'm sure you've read it at some point. It's worth rereading. Because you can imagine the negotiations and all the painstaking work that went into getting these delegates to agree on these 30 articles. Article 26 basically says education is a human right. Because you're a human being, no matter what the color of your skin, no matter what your station in life, no matter what your religion is, you have a right to be educated. And what this document expresses is that a social contract, this is a social contract, has several parties. So you have the kids who have that right, and the rest of us, the community, in this case the global community, that commits to creating the conditions so you can achieve that right, because this is the assumption of this declaration. That's what it would take to have peace in the world, is to build an order of things where every human can have the assurance that because they're a human being, the rest of humanity is going to help them achieve some of these rights. You know? Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the right to be educated, and so on. And so 70 years ago is nothing. Probably your parents were alive, or your grandparents were alive when these conversations were taking place. This is really yesterday. I point this out only to show that great things have happened in the world when people have set their minds to it. That just like those high school students in southern Mexico decided that it was important to bring water to the school so that all students, girls and boys, could come to school every day and they could solve that problem. And just like my former students who created a program to make that kind of opportunity available to many students could achieve that, and just like Soraya Santi could bring entrepreneurship education to every country in the Middle East. So it was with people like Jane Addams, or John Dewey, or Horace Mann, or Mary Peabody Mann. Once they decided we're going to achieve this goal, and we're going to work to that, they pretty much changed the world. And as evidence of that, just think about this fact. 70 years ago, the majority of the children in the world could not set foot in a school. And today, over 90% of the children in the world begin school and spend in school in average 7 years. Doesn't mean they get to 7th grade, because many of them repeat, but they spend 7 years. This is a dramatic transformation in a 7-decade period. To have done that for humanity, I can't think of anything comparable. To have given every member of the human race a shared institutional experience in these institutions that we invented to empower people. Now, it doesn't mean that all of those institutions are actually empowering people, so we have work to do. This is unfinished business. But I'll give you a second example of how having these very ambitious, very audacious goals, even for the world, can produce dramatic changes. About 20 years ago, the UN mobilized a big effort in drafting a compact to eliminate poverty. And this compact was called the Millennium Development Goals. It basically said, we can eliminate poverty in one generation. We can do that. We didn't completely eliminate poverty, but the incidence of poverty more than half globally in 2 decades. The MDGs have just been superseded by a new set of goals approved by the last General Assembly of the United Nations called the Sustainable Development Goals. These are very ambitious goals. There are 17 goals that are qualitatively different. They're not a linear expansion because, for example, for education, they are about producing empowered global citizens. These goals recognize that the world is increasingly interdependent and that it is going to take every person to understand that interdependence, to understand the challenges that we share, whether those are the challenges of how do we develop sustainable forms interacting with the environment, how do we make sure that we can work out our differences based on religious faiths in peaceful ways, which remains an issue in the US as it does in India or Pakistan or many places around the world. And so the premise of the SDGs is that we better confront these big shared global challenges, and to do that, we're going to have to educate every person. We're going to have to use these institutions that we invented to produce global citizens. So this brings me to global citizenship, which is one of the topics of conversation tonight. And so these are the goals. You might want to look at them. By the way, in case this sounds too up in the sky, SDGs, what these students, high school students, were doing in Mexico when they brought water to the school, they were working on at least 3 of those goals. Goal number 4, which is about bringing quality education to all. Goal number 5, which is about achieving gender equality. And goal number 6, which is about bringing clean water and sanitation. And so these are not goals for the UN to solve. These are goals for ordinary people to solve for themselves, pretty much in the same spirit in which Ben Franklin went and created a public library in Philadelphia, or found a way to create an insurance company or a firefighters association, right? Is equip young people with the skills to understand what these things mean to them locally, and to figure out a way to work with others to make these goals part of a shared experience of their communities, of members of their communities. Now, will these goals make a difference to education globally? I think so. I just gave you an example of how this global education movement that began 70 years ago transformed humanity in giving us a shared experience in schools. And this is some of the evidence of what the MDGs, the predecessor to the Sustainable Development Goals, did. In 1990, 60% of the world population lived on less than $1.25 per day. And that percentage is down in these 3 regions, Latin America, Middle East, and Europe and Central Asia, under 10%. And even in the place where this percentage is higher, which is Sub-Saharan Africa, this is down to almost 40%. This is remarkable to see that we can now. We have a lot of work to do, obviously. Is it a good thing that we have 40% of the people living under $1.25 a day? No, we have to keep working. But to have achieved that in 25 years for the world, given the scale of the population involved, is pretty impressive. But this is a qualitative leap, as I mentioned. Education is core to achieving those goals. And I think what I want to come back to the beginning of my presentation, I think the goal for education is really about empowering kids. It's about pausing and asking, what are we going to do with these institutions that we invented? What are they for? It's really about a conversation on how do we make sure that the education, that the learning opportunities we provide students are relevant to the challenges of their times. And the challenges of their times are, for us, the kind of political discourse that we have, which makes it kosher to be a bigot, makes it acceptable to be a bigot, and to harass people because of their identities, whatever it is. So this is a challenge we're going to have to educate our kids to improve upon. But the challenges include also religious intolerance. There are places around the world where people die because of their religious faith, and other forms of discrimination and bigotry around the world. But they also include the challenges of poverty and inequality, and continuing to reduce the percentage of people who live under the poverty line, and making sure that there is enough common shared experience and opportunities across different groups in any society, so you can have one society and not many societies within one roof. These are all challenges that we know well in America because we have them at home. So empowerment is about preparing students with the skills to do the kinds of things that those students were doing in Mexico. So this book that I'm going to tell you about examines to what extent education systems around the world are doing that, are empowering kids. I'm going to talk for a moment about one dimension of empowerment, which is global competency. Is what would it mean to produce these global citizens that goal number 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals hopes for? So when people think about global competency, they think about it in at least 3 ways. And I'm going to suggest that we should more intentionally focus in one of those ways. For some people, it's about getting more people to complete college, complete high school or complete college. It's the way I used to think about it until 9/11. If we just, education is a wonderful thing. If we could get people to get more of it, this would be a good thing. And I think that is true, provided education is worthwhile. Education can also be pretty boring, as we know for the students, or the students can perceive that it is not very relevant to the demands of their lives, to their needs, to what they want to do. But that's one definition, is how do we make sure that we have more engineers and more college graduates than other nations. Another way to think about global competency is to think about it in the way in which Amanda Ripley describes that. How many of you have read Amanda Ripley's book, The Smartest Kids in the World? Right, so basically, what is her basis? She looks at an assessment of mathematics skills that is administered to 15-year-olds old. And this assessment began, it's also an invention of yesterday. OECD began to assess student competencies in the year 2000, creating an exercise that, just like the World Values Surveys, takes representative samples of 15-year-olds or in school around the world and assesses, every 3 years they assess a different competency, and they alternate between literacy, mathematics, and science. And so the Smartest Kids in the World is based on the 2012 administration of PISA, which assesses mostly mathematics. And so some people, when they talk about high-performing systems, what they mean is the systems where their students perform at the highest levels in the PISA test. And it's a useful definition, but it's good to remember that it's an incomplete definition, because empowerment is not only about performing well in a math test, or in a language test, or in a science test. In fact, I'm going to argue, based on the work that is presented in that book, that empowerment is about a lot more than that. It's about developing, yes, cognitive skills, but also knowledge of yourself, what people would have called character, and your capacity to get things done with others. And until now, PISA has not been measuring those things. They're interested in measuring them. At this conference in Dubai that I was at, I was with Andreas Schleicher, who's responsible for PISA, and he's keenly interested in measuring 21st century skills, in measuring socio-emotional competencies, in measuring character and leadership and social skills. He realizes it's a little harder to do than to measure mathematical skill. The third definition of global competency, I'm going to argue, is understanding things like the SDGs and why we should care. Understanding what each of those goals are, why they are important. Not only understanding the facts, but caring about the facts and having the skills to make a difference about them. And these, of course, can be taught. I learned that in a good way some years ago when a group of people who created an independent school in New York, to be eventually a global school with 20 campuses, the Avenue Schools, they came and said, well, you've been writing about global competency, why don't you design a curriculum to do that? And I had, for the first time, the challenge of developing not a lesson, not a course, but a K-12 curriculum in global studies. And of course, that experience convinced me that you can do that. Like any curriculum, you begin with the end in mind, and you think about what are the dispositions and the knowledge and the skills that students should have. How are we going to know if they have them? And how are we going to construct the experiences so that they gain those capacities? And how are we going to sequence those experiences so that it's doable for the students and for the teachers? So like any curriculum, this can be done. I discovered then that this idea was not new. There have been many people who had an idea to develop global competency over the years. One of them was an educator, Kurt Hand, who invented, I was talking about Kurt Weibock earlier, who invented the United World Colleges. At the end of World War II, the man very interested in peace, and he said, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if I brought into a high school like these, just for the last 2 years of high school, kids from all over the world, and in the shared experience, day-to-day experience, as they studied their regular subjects, they would discover the common humanity that they have across all the lines of difference they're going to experience. And United World Colleges has scaled a little bit. There are 14 of those around the world. The last one was just created in China. But it was mostly an experiential education. It was not an explicit curriculum. The curriculum was in mixing the kids up. It was in the integrating the school. The International Baccalaureate, which was first designed at the first United World College and then became its own organization, was also designed in part to produce a certain international mindedness of students. And there have been a number of global studies curriculum. Anyway, so this can be done, but this is not yet a subject in any school that I know of. For a while, I served as chair of an advisory committee to the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Ed. This is when Driscoll was the Commissioner on global studies. And part of what we did was to take stock of how were we doing these in the Commonwealth? How were we developing cosmopolitanism? And it's a potpourri of things that we do, but I would call the approach kind of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's infusion is the way we do it. And what everybody does are these fairs, once a year. I participated in many of them. When you were the principal, you bring the parents who have some different ethnic backgrounds, and they bring you food, and they bring some pictures, and so, like Art Khan, you show the kids that you have diversity in your school, and you celebrate. So that a lot of people do in some places. They take world geography or history more serious than in other places. In some places they have some study abroad, for the most part, for a few kids. Not everybody participates in that. And there are various things that we do, but there isn't anything coherent. Massachusetts hasn't, to date, decided, gee, this is so important that we should have a Massachusetts curriculum of global studies, and we should figure out what is it that Massachusetts graduates should know and care about and be able to do, and how are we going to teach them that? There are states that have done that. There are states that have done that. Wisconsin did that several years ago, and within their state frameworks, they looked at it. They didn't create a new subject, but they looked at the existing subjects, and they said, let's map where are we going to intentionally build opportunities to develop global competency in the chemistry curriculum, in the physics curriculum, in the language curriculum, in the social studies curriculum, and so on. So we could do that, but we don't do enough of it. I would argue that, given the way the world is changing, the speed at which it is changing, and the fact that schools aren't quite keeping pace with those changes. I mean, for the most part, schools, in terms of the core, are slow to change. We change the pedagogies, we change the buildings, we change the rhetoric, but if you look at what is it that we teach things that we've been teaching for a very long time. And it takes us a lot of conversations to get rid of anything that we have taught, or to approach differently how we teach things. I mean, those of you who are in the high school know what I'm talking about. Each of these subjects have an owner, and someone can come and say, wouldn't it be nice to do interdisciplinary? Maybe it's a little easier here because you're a smaller place and a small town, so maybe it's easier for you to do that. But in most places, interdisciplinarity is really difficult, right? Because once you own physics, this is your turf. And this history person isn't going to come and tell you how you're going to do physics. You know what physics the kids need to know. And so it's hard to get rid of things, and consequently it's very difficult to get new things in the curriculum, including the kinds of things that could help us develop cosmopolitanism for our kids, which I would argue are very, very important, very necessary in this time and age. Now, what I mean by that, I don't mean necessarily teach them more facts, although that's important. I mean the capacity to understand this process called globalization, to anticipate risks, to manage them, and to create opportunities that can advance human well-being in a highly integrated global context. Gee, if we could produce people like Eleanor Roosevelt in our schools, or like Ben Franklin, or like Jane Addams, wouldn't that be wonderful? If we try to figure out what were the traits of those people, what made them so great, what made them doers who are capable to imagine a better world and to build it, and then figure out how do we make our schools, these remarkable institutions that we have invented in the last 150 years, the kind of place where you learn to act like them, to be like them. So I think that developing global competency is about that. Now we have, as you know, a lot of challenges to do that. This fellow works at the Karolinska Institute. I'm sure you've heard of him, Hans Rosling. He teaches public health. And he observed that his graduate students, his master's students in public health, were quite aware of some basic facts around the world. And he said, gee, maybe I have a particularly bad group of students. So he designed a little survey, factual survey, asking some basic facts around the world. Like I just showed you that slide, right? That showed that poverty rates have halved over the last 25 years. So he asked a representative sample of college students in Sweden. Over the last 25 years, have poverty rates remained the same, increased, or declined? He found only 7% knew the facts. I mean, worst, I'm guessing, right? And then he said, gee, are we particularly stupid? So he did the same with a sample of kids in the UK. And he found the same thing. And then he did the same with some American kids. So his survey, you can find it in Google, is now called the Ignorance Survey. It is a little bit scary that at a time when our interdependence is so important to our own ability to survive, not only to take care of this world, to take care of ourselves and of our communities, where every local affair is so connected with something that is global, that we should be so dismissive of the facts, of the evidence, that we don't know the facts. We're talking graduate students. By the way, Rosling then gave his survey to larger samples of people, and he said, is there a difference between high school, people who only have finished high school, and people who have completed a college degree? You guess what the finding was? No difference. Makes no difference whether you go to college in terms of you know the basic facts about the world in which you live. And so, it's not only an American challenge, it is also an American challenge, but it is a challenge of our times, right? Now, I think the challenge is also about this painting, and there's so many stories in that painting. You know the author, right? Norman Rockwell. And there are at least 2 stories in that painting. When the UN was created, as a result of Eleanor Roosevelt convening all these people in the San Francisco Opera House and getting them to agree that the only way we're going to have peace in the world is if we could agree on some basic rights and then build some institutions to advance those rights. So the UN is a byproduct of that. And Rockwell was pretty excited. He had lived through World War II. He really, it's funny how we value peace when we don't have it. We seem to value it more when we don't have it, right? And so those who lived through the war were really keen on creating the conditions so we wouldn't have another war like that. And he began a sketch representing the UN. And he painted that in his studio. And sat on it for 10 years. Didn't finish the painting. The only painting that he eventually finished 10 years later was this painting. Now, this was not the original painting. I'm going to show the original sketch in a moment because I think there's a story in the choice that he finally made. And this painting, every nation in the world has made sort of an offering to the UN in the form of a gift, which is exhibited in their big gallery on the second floor of the main building in New York. And the gift from the US is a big mosaic, about this big, based on this painting. It's a beautiful painting. What you see, what to me it represents is the strength in difference, right? The coming together of people from very different identities. And what you see here, the title of this painting is The Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So it's this basic notion. I'm trying to think that the UN, which was created to have peace, in Norman Rockwell's mind, was represented in, this is what it's going to take to have peace, is to create the mechanisms so we can live by the golden rule across all forms of difference. Now I want to show you what the original painting was. The original sketch was this, the one that sat in his studio for a long time. It had in the foreground representatives of the US, of the UK, and of the Soviet Union, and in the background it had the people. Almost as if the people of the world are looking over the shoulders of the representatives of governments who will have to bring us peace, right? Now you realize that the painting is, he took that painting from that, he makes from that corner and this corner, but he forgot the governments in the end. Isn't that an interesting transition? That in those 10 years, I never could ask Rockwell those questions, but I imagine if I had asked him the questions, why did you replace this painting with the other painting, he would have answered something like, I understood that peace was not about governments and representatives, but it was about the people. That if we were going to have peace, what it would take would be not for governments to learn to work out their differences in peaceful ways, but for people, for ordinary people, to be empowered to be able to do that. We will only have peace. And I bring this back to this aspiration of the Enlightenment, that in the end, improving the world is something that is going to be done not by royalty or by governments, but by ordinary people, taking responsibility and coming together with others to improve their well-being and the communities of which they are a part. So what would that mean in terms of the competencies that people would need to do that? Now, we had a bunch of challenges, and I won't take too long to tell you about that. I'm going back to that World Values Survey that I mentioned a while ago. And so in the last administration, people were asked, have you heard of the Millennium Development Goals? I just showed you how consequential those goals were, right? Poverty rates decline by half over 25 years. And so if you ask representative samples of the population in, say, Canada, have you heard of these MDGs? Only about 12% of people in Canada have heard about them. And if you ask in, I think this is Finland, it's a little bit better. It's more like 70%. They've heard of these goals. If you ask in the US, it's about 5% of the population have heard of these goals. So it's Rosling's concern, it's Rosling's puzzle, right? How are we going to be empowered to be global citizens if we don't understand the basic facts about the world? That same survey asks people what are important qualities that should be cultivated in children, and then codes the responses. So one of the options is tolerance and respect for other people. Rockwell, the golden rule, universal declaration of human rights. So the good news is that in most countries, it's more than half. So that's great. More than half of the adults think that we should teach kids to be tolerant. But of course, we should worry about the gap between the top section of that bar and 100%, which in the US is about 30%. So I guess it's a good thing to know that twice as many people in the US think that it's a good thing to teach that, but it should worry us that 30% don't think this is important, because if that 30% get organized and they become more vocal and they become bullies, they can hijack this experiment and they can create the rules. And if the 70% are silent, they're going to define how we live. And so we need to engage our students in this conversation, right? Here are some of the findings from that survey. People were asked, to what extent would you trust a person of a different nationality? Exactly the same idea that is in Norman Rockwell's painting. So, no one trusts completely someone who carries a different passport. Look at the numbers. Highest in India, where it's 20%. But most countries, it's about 5%, including this nation of immigrants, right? But it will be better if you say trust somewhat. So trust somewhat, many more people trust somewhat. It's like, are you happy? Very happy, somewhat happy? Well, same thing. This is trust completely, trust somewhat. So that brings the number up to almost 70% for the US. But as with tolerance, there are 30% of the people who would not trust at all, or very much, someone from a different nationality. So this is problematic, because these 30% can get organized. They can get a little crazy. They can get a little carried away. And this is the risk with neo-Nazi groups in Germany, for example. They are not a majority. But if they organize, and if they hijack the rules of democracy to get their ways, they can create a lot of havoc for a lot of people. Or the Ku Klux Klan, or any group that decides that it's okay to engage in the open practice of intolerance and in bullying those who are different than you are. Other questions from that survey. When people were asked, to what extent do you agree with the statement? Remember Washington and Moses' Exodus? The only acceptable religion is mine. So no one, very few people are complete bigots that would strongly agree with that, but there's some. In the US, it's about 8% of the people believe that they are the only ones entitled to their religious beliefs. But when you add to that not only strongly agree, but agree, it's 1 in 5 for America. It's 1 in 5 in Singapore. It's a lot bigger in Malaysia. So I worry about this. I worry about this because to some extent, I think there's a connection between these and the fact that we're still fighting religious wars around the world, everywhere, right? Open wars or low-intensity conflict in many places. This is at the core of that. And remember, this is a survey. A lot of people are smart enough to know what the right answer is. So I take these findings with a grain of salt. When people would openly tell you, I believe that I'm the only one who's entitled to my religion. And once you get into that territory, it's a small step to hatred. Someone can come in and say, well, how about if we define the rules and we're going to blame those who have believe in a different God for your misfortunes. And why don't we get organized and we kick them out of here? Or we take their businesses? Or we do some harm to them. Now you no longer think you have a common humanity with those people. You no longer believe you have to live by the golden rule. This is exactly what Mussolini did, it's what Hitler did. It's happened time and again in history, that people would decide to exploit our miseries to create an order of things which has nothing to do with a democratic experiment, with a nation of equals, built on the assumption that people are fundamentally equal to one another. Speaking of which, I serve on the State Board of Higher Ed, and these are public meetings, so I'm not going to reveal any confidence to you. But At the last meeting of the board, we had a joint meeting of the boards of elementary and secondary education and higher ed. And the two commissioners presented a resolution which they wanted the boards to endorse, stating that one of the goals of our K through 12 should be to prepare people for democratic citizenship. It's like mother and apple pie. You know, when I saw that on the agenda, I said, who's going to object? In Massachusetts, the birthplace of public education and of democracy in America. And to my surprise, I heard 3 objections of this sort. These are public records, you can find them. One person said, well, this document says that our schools should produce active democratic citizens who engage in the active practice of democracy. I object to that. I don't think we should be engaged in that business in our schools. That sounds, this person said to me, like communism. Wow. Then there was another person who said, this document says that our schools should teach our students to value the fundamental equality among all people. I object to that. This sounds to me like indoctrination. And I'm thinking like I'm in some sitcom or a really movie, that this cannot be happening. I'm talking 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. And the third person who objected, I forget what his grounds were, but I thought, wow, this is really interesting. We did pass the resolution, but it does tell me that democracy is indeed, as Benjamin Franklin thought, what ordinary people do with their daily acts. And no one has. I mean, democracy is always a work in progress. And it's always in flux. And it's always, to some extent, in danger. Because you can have people who come out of nowhere and decide that maybe we shouldn't teach people the golden rule. And maybe we should teach them that there is one faith that is the faith. And those who have a different kind of faith don't have a right to their beliefs. And maybe we can teach them, I don't know what, which I think puts those students at risk. I mean, as we prepare bullies into this world, you can imagine what their lives are going to be like in a world that is ever more interdependent and more integrated. So, I'm only showing you these slides to say that it is not like mother and apple pie. In that same survey, people were asked, I mean, I guess they were asked, are you a racist, in a slightly more polite way. They said, who would you rather not have as a neighbor? And they were given a bunch of categories. Now again, people are smart. They know what the right answer is. That is, there is a lot of social desirability in these answers. But the findings are troubling, because there is a percentage of the population everywhere who will say they'd rather not have as a neighbor someone as a different race. That percentage is actually very high in India, in Japan, in South Korea, and in Malaysia. We should be happy that it's not very high, but not so happy that there are 5% of the population who have no problem in saying, I'd rather not have a neighbor of a different race. How about immigrants? Well, a little bit worse. 5% becomes 15%. And I'm thinking, hello, isn't this a country of immigrants? You know, except for the Native Americans who maybe came from somewhere much further back. Everyone here is that story. Brooklyn is everybody's story. So where did these 15% of the people come from? Did they forget who they were, where they came from? What is it that we're not teaching in schools that would cause people to have these preferences, right? People of a different religion. We do better on religion than we do on race and than we do on national origin, which I guess speaks well of Washington's conversation with Moses Sexton. People who speak a different language, pretty much as with immigrants, right? We're not so appreciative of people who speak a different language. So what are we going to have to do to build those competencies? Well, I think we're going to have to work on these 3 domains, and this is from the book, right? So cognition, relationships, and self-knowledge. What do I mean by each one of them? Well, cognition means 3 things. There is knowledge of facts. It's pretty difficult to have cognitive processing if you don't have substance, subject matter, if you don't know the facts. And we've seen that for global competency, some of it is about knowing the facts. But you need also to be able to use those facts to do something with them, to solve problems, to have skills. And you also need to have the capacity to be innovative, to be creative. The kind of competencies that those students in southern Mexico displayed when they said, how do we get the water into this school? How do we find a way to negotiate in their case with our neighbor so we have water in our day to solve that? But that's only one bucket of things that we need to do. And it's the bucket the findings in the book, so these are the categories we use to code the Common Core and a bunch of other things. And the Common Core is mostly about this. It's a good thing that it's not just about knowledge, and it's not just about processing, it's also about creativity, but it's mostly about these. And most of the curriculum is about these, but there are differences in nations. In India, for example, you'll see in a moment, there is more. Let me just list what some of these competencies are. So for processing, it's the kind of stuff that that you think about is important for your students or your children. For knowledge, this includes things of this sort. And creativity is something that is more recent, I think, to most of our educational institutions as a goal. But then there is also relationships. I was talking to one of you who works in the kindergarten that we do this better at the kindergarten level, and it's all downhill from there in many places. That resonates with my experience. So basically, it's teaching kids how do you work with other people, teaching them the golden rule. I remember when you were the principal of a urban school where my sons attended, that kindergarten had these wonderful, what do they call it, tile talk or something like that. They sat the kids in a circle every day, and they basically checked in on everybody. They went around and said, how are things going? And kids talked about their lives and what was happening and their relationships. And what a wonderful, simple protocol to follow, to teach kids to reflect, to pay attention to their feelings, to other feelings, to their impact in other people, to develop some social awareness, some empathy, some perspective taking, right? So these things can be taught. But for them, they did a lot of that in kindergarten, some of it in elementary, middle school, less and less. And by the time they were in high school, it was all the classes and the APs and the sports. The sports did a better job at building those social skills. But it really was, to some extent, downhill. I suppose it has to do with the history of the kindergarten movement. It's more recent. It's more enlightened to some extent. It has less layers of history. But you're not so hopeful that it's moving in the right direction. You worry a little bit that we're forgetting that there are good things that children learn when they play and when they have unscheduled time to play with each other. It's also about leadership. But it's also about self-knowledge, right? Which includes the capacity to be open-minded, to entertain the possibility that you might not be right all the time, to be flexible, to be adaptable, to appreciate art and culture, to take personal and social responsibility, to be able to navigate different cultural codes, to appreciate diversity, adaptability, capacity to learn throughout your life, and intellectual history. And then a certain work ethic, kinds of things that get people to be doers and to take responsibility, and then self-efficacy. This notion that you can set goals for yourself, you can monitor yourself and manage yourself. So to an extent, I think global competency is still about producing the attributes that get us to this painting, to living in a world where we see difference as a tremendous source of strength. And we have students who understand that and not the country. So anyway, I probably have talked for longer than I was supposed to. But maybe we can have a few questions, and I can certainly talk more about the book if you want me to, or the research that we're doing, or anything else that is in your mind.
So I'm sure you've heard it argued that the resurgence of extremism around the world. No, I really can't do this. No, I'm sure you've heard it argued somewhere that the resurgence of extremism around the world might be a sort of a reaction or being threatened by a blending or a globalization and a fear of loss of individual cultural identity. How do you read that, and how would you incorporate that?
Yeah, I've heard that. I've thought a little bit about extremism. I haven't thought very much about extremism in this country, of which we have our share. But I've thought about extremism like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so on, and I've participated in meetings with people who think about that. And I think it's complicated. On the one hand, there are many young people around the world who find it very difficult to make a transition to adult roles. Because the world is very volatile, I think in part because technology is changing the way in which we produce things so rapidly. It's very difficult for anybody to have any certainty about what is the future going to look like 10 years from now. When you think about the fact that most of the jobs, half of the jobs that people are going to experience haven't yet been invented, that produces uncertainty in this country and in other places. But in some places, that difficulty of transitioning into adult roles, finding a job, being able to support yourself, being able to become independent from your parents, it's very difficult for people. And there are many young people in that situation. So what you have are people who are in limbo, in a sense, in a social limbo. They're no longer kids. They're not adults. They don't have the attributes of independent adults. They are nowhere. I'll give you an example. In Mexico, 40% of the population between the ages 15 and 25 are neither in school nor working. They're in that social limbo. So that limbo is flammable. You can do a lot of things with kids who don't know what to do with their lives, including inciting them to criminal activity. And criminal activity might be of a political, so it as in terrorism, or it could be just drugs. You get these kids who are in limbo and you tell them, when you come over here, I'm going to give you a cell phone and $100 a month. And all you have to do is stand in the corner. And whenever you see police, just text a message. That's all you do. And when you have nothing else to do, $100 is like a lot of money and a mobile phone. And then, if you do that well for a while, say, well, now I'm going to give you a motorcycle. And you need to do more. You need to carry things, maybe weapons, from one place to another. And now I'm going to give you $500. Oh, you're somebody now. And there are people who love you. Those who have incited you to do that, and those who watch you with money in your pocket, when 40% of your peers are in that limbo. And so this is how you become someone involved in the drug industry in Mexico. I've talked to people who studied that thing, or perhaps in gangs in the US. And I imagine it's not a very different process for people who get inducted into terrorist organizations. So there is that piece of it. There is also the piece of figuring out who am I in this world, which I think every person has the right to answer. And I think it is a complicated world in which people answer. I mean, I find it I haven't studied that, but I've asked colleagues who study these things, how come we have had so far a lower per capita incident per immigrants in America? We have less American-born children of immigrants who engage in the kind of oppositional behavior that we have seen in Belgium or in London or in Paris than we see in Europe. And I'm puzzled by that. I have some hypotheses. And one of the hypotheses is that we actually still are a more open society than some of those places. There are entire neighborhoods in Birmingham. I was talking to someone who was a commissioner in schools, I think it was Birmingham, that when people are so segregated by their religious origin, and where the lack of jobs is so evident, but to some extent the racism, the barriers are so clear for them to belong, that you can imagine, you can understand that some people would have a hard time answering the question, who am I? Well, I'm neither Pakistani, even though my parents were born in Pakistan, nor British, because obviously I can't do many of the things that British citizens can do. And so who am I? And so in that social limbo of not knowing who you are, I imagine a percentage of the population is susceptible to being inducted by people who are very savvy, these are not amateurs, at finding that person, which I'm sure exists in every high school, a teenager who doesn't know who they are, and you see them, and they need someone who will reach out and bring them in. And so imagine if you're in a place where someone is on the lookout for those kids and says, I'm going to reach out to you and I'm going to poison your mind because I'm going to convince you that you belong with my group. And eventually I'm going to tell you that my group is going to find meaning and a better life in heaven if you blow yourself up and cause some harm to your fellow citizens in that place. So I haven't really studied that. I don't think very many have. I had a chance about a year ago to participate in a meeting on counterterrorism prevention at the UN. And they invited people who study things in global, so they invited me. I don't study terrorism, it's not my thing, but I had a chance to listen to other people who actually study those things. And I realized that the knowledge base is thin. And so there were some people there who work in different intelligence communities. This was a global meeting, and I said, can't we, I imagine we can study this phenomenon. Why don't you look at these people who follow that path and try to figure out what the trajectory was? And well, the complicated thing is that a lot of that information is classified, it exists, but it's not being used for the kind of scholarly purpose you're talking about. But I imagine that there are some people trying to figure that out. So it's a long answer to a good question for which I really have no answer. Yeah.
So I have a question about difference. So I teach high school English, and my background, I began teaching in the public schools, now I teach in a private school. And one of the things that I lament about the private school classroom is just the lack of diversity. So because I believe
You mean what kind of diversity you're talking about?
more socioeconomic and racial both. So we're very much a bubble. School has very high tuition. But I'm curious the difference. I feel like so much of empathy happens when you meet someone who's different from you, you forge a relationship individually first, and then you start to be more curious, maybe about difference more broadly. But I'm wondering with your research, when you think about even within the public schools, often we see kids tracked into different levels. And so even there are questions about how diverse really are kids' classrooms. So in terms of structures, what do you think is the best classroom structure in which for kids to develop these kinds of things?
So there are some things we know. There was a sociologist in the 50s named Alport, who worked at Harvard, who basically developed intercontact theory. He was very interested in interrace relations in America. And he had the same notion that the founder of the United World College had, that if you just brought people together, they would find the common hypothesis. This is what Alport argued, arguing for racial integration of schools. We now know from people who have researched that it's not enough to bring people together, that they actually need to have interactions of a certain kind so that being together leads to finding the common humanity. For example, they need to be in situations of equal power. You can't bring, so whatever the task is, you can't bring two groups, you can name it A and B, and have them participate in a task where one of the groups has clear dominance over the other. That doesn't lead to finding the common humanity. That reinforces stereotypes for both groups, for A and B. And so what that tells me, that research, that Alport's theory was not incorrect but incomplete, is that this process needs to be actively supported so that you actually create those opportunities for kids. I find that sports, of all things, I think one of the most democratic institutions, and I haven't done research on that, but I have a son who was an athlete in high school, and I watched him play a range of sports, but especially basketball. And I thought, so our hope is maybe more in sports, because the classes are tracked as well, and they're tracked by ability level in a way that in many places is absolutely correlated with socioeconomic because of all the other advantages that come with money, with financial resources in the forms of extra help that parents buy for their students, or just the fact that some kids have more complicated lives than other kids, and it's harder to study when you have a complicated life. And the kids know that, and they see that in the school, and so you have these tracks, even in a classroom. And so I think you need to facilitate an opportunity for the students to, first of all, experience situations that are truly on a level playing field across lines of difference. And I think that's doable. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's arts, maybe it is other ways to facilitate that. Maybe it's give all of them something challenging, like bring the water, to maybe engage them in authentic problem solving, where no one will have an advantage that necessarily correlates with wealth, or with race, or with gender, right? So yeah, it is a challenge that we have to work on. But it's easier to work on the challenge where you have that diversity than to work on the challenge where you also have kids of a certain kind. Yeah.
So I'm wondering,
Francis.
I'm wondering, as you think about your vision for global education, as you think about the state of Massachusetts, what do you think would be an ideal over the next 3 years, let's say, to have leaders in Massachusetts do and educators in Massachusetts to start making the kind of fast progress that you say we need to make?
So I'm going to give you two answers. First one is going to begin with a story. So as I'm doing the research for this book, one of the case studies is about Massachusetts. You should know that in 2008, the governor asked the Secretary of Education to put together a task force to develop a blueprint for 21st century education. And there was a wonderful group of people who produced a phenomenal document. You should read it, you should find it. And there's only one problem with that document. Very few people have read it. And the authors of the document, I know because I interviewed them, don't remember what's in the document. In interviewing some of them, I said, well, how about that paper? They said, oh yeah, can you send me a copy of that paper? Now, there's another country that around the same time that Massachusetts developed that blueprint that we then forgot about, developed a blueprint, not as developed actually as Massachusetts. And that country is Singapore. So for us it was 2008, for them I think it was late 2009. That nation that is only 50 years old, 50, made the last of the 4 iterations they have made in their entire history in education. And they said, we're going to do 21st century education for everybody. And heavily in the 21st century education is promoting global awareness and global citizenship for all their kids. And at the core of that is the development of ethics, an ethical framework that would help you engage with the world on a basis of mutuality, on a basis of I guess, level relationship with others. So one difference between Massachusetts and Singapore is that Singapore actually has executed that vision. So as I'm doing the case study of Massachusetts, and I'm interviewing the commissioner, Mitch Chester says, which country does this really well, what do you think? I said, well, Singapore is an interesting story. He says, well, next time your colleagues from Singapore are here, let's do a little round table. So we did that. We had about 25 people meet with them to hear how are they preparing their teachers, how are they preparing their principals. And then at that meeting, Paul Toner, who was the former president of the Massachusetts Teacher Association, said, you know, we should take a group of educators from the state to Singapore to see. So we did that. We got a group of, initially we were going to take the commissioners and so on, and then politics got in the way and the commissioner couldn't travel when the trip was happening. But we got 20 people to come to Singapore last fall. And we got to see phenomenal things by way of global awareness, for example. These are 2 of the ways in which Singapore prepares their principals. If you're a principal in school, you might observe someone in your staff, a teacher that you think has real leadership potential. You see that they like to do things out of the classroom, they're good at organizing others, they're thinking about the future. I call that person and say, you know, I'd like to nominate you for this course at the NIE. The NIE is the National Institute of Education, is the single teacher education institution. They do all pre-service and in-service professional development in that country of 4 million. You should know Massachusetts has about 4 million people who are geographically more extended than they are. But unlike Singapore, which only has 1 institution, we have 80 institutions that prepare teachers. This is pre-service and 120 programs. This is all pre-service and many more in-service programs. And by and large, we do a lot in service, a lot less in service than they do. Anyway, so I said Singapore. So Toner says, let's take a group of people. We went to Singapore. And we observed that one of the ways in which they prepare the principals is they nominate them for that course where 2 things are going to happen to you as a principal in training. First one is you keep your salary, but you're going to be removed from your school and you're going to be placed in a school that is different than the school you know. So if you're an elementary school teacher, you're going to be placed in a high school or vice versa. The second thing that's going to happen to you is you're in that school in that morning, but in the afternoon you go to the NIE and to study. And the first assignment is they tell every student, you should be reading on scenario building. And you should developing scenarios for what Singapore could be like 25 years from now, politically, socially, economically. And so you engage in that project of imagining a range of possible futures. And imagine you're studying that with all your fellow principles in the making, and you're doing forecasting, what could it be like? And so you then say, well, now that you have, which of these features are better than others? Some of the features are great, some are not so great. Singapore has a terrible history of religious and race riots. Early in its history, they almost burn each other apart over religious differences. And to some extent, and paradoxically, it's a good thing they have that history, because the generation that experienced that is alive, and they don't ever want to see that again. And so they're really adamant in inculcating kids religious tolerance, because they don't want to burn each other alive as they once tried to do 40 years ago. And so, of course, one of the possible future scenarios is, as we forget the history, we do that again. And we kind of activate all the bigotry that is there everywhere, right? And they say, okay, what should schools look like so that our future 25 years from now is more like the better scenarios that you can imagine than the worst? So you figure out what the school could look like. So, well, what could it look like for the school that you're in as a guest? And then once you figure that out, say, well, what do you think could be a trajectory to go from where the school is today to where they would be? So you figure that out, and then say, okay, why don't you begin the process? Think about what a way to prepare people for leadership. You begin with vision about the future, not about the future of education, about the future of the society. You link that to a vision for education. You then backward map a trajectory for your school, and then in a school where you have no authority, you're a guest, you are asked to see if you can persuade people to begin to do things. So that's one of the things we watch. The second thing we watch is they send all those principals in training for 2 weeks at government's expense all over the world, different places. And their task was, study something that you think is truly interesting and try to understand why it's interesting and why this innovation is working. So I was with the Massachusetts delegation in a room smaller than this one, sort of a big flat surface, with all these groups who have gone in teams of 3 and 4 and spent 2 weeks in another country studying innovation globally. Now, it's a tiny society that is very global, that wants to be even more global, so you cannot breathe global in Singapore, right? But it also is intentionally global, and it's accelerating how it wants to prepare its students to be global. So, why am I telling you this long story in response to your question of what do I want to see in Massachusetts? Because that's the question that we ask ourselves. What do we want to see in Massachusetts? And so, I thought on the last day on the bus with my delegation, I said, well, what are we going to do in Massachusetts, what we have learned? And I remember that John Quincy Adams, who was John Adams' son, who was the 6th US president, he was at some point ambassador in a little country called Silesia. Silesia eventually was Prussia, eventually was Germany. And they had some of the early public schools in their counties. And so when he was ambassador there, he observed that public education didn't exist in this country. And so he said, he wrote this book, he wrote these observations, which were published in Boston under the title Letters on Silesia. And it's basically an account of how another nation organized public education. And the history goes that eventually that stimulated the imagination of people in this Commonwealth and the fact that maybe we could one day have public schools. So I told the people on the bus this story, and I said, why don't you each write a letter on Singapore? And the letter should have 2 pieces. What did you learn? And what do you think Massachusetts could learn from that? And let's agree when we come back to meet 3 times in meetings like the ones you convene and try to figure out what do we want Massachusetts to do differently. So we did that. And we're going to publish that as a little book that should be out in about 6 weeks. It's going to be titled Letters on Singapore. Right? Subtitle should be in memory of John Quincy Adams, but it's not the subtitle, but I tell the story. And so there we have recommendations for school principals, for teacher education institutions, for district leaders, for the public, for the State House, and for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And you won't have to wait too long, and we're publishing this book in a way that it'll cost $1 online, because our goal in a very decentralized state like Massachusetts is that the only way to translate that knowledge into something that fuels a conversation is to really make this knowledge accessible to anyone who wants it. And so we're going to publish this thing so that you can get it in Kindle for $1, or you can actually buy the physical book for about $4. And so anyway, more to come. You'll hear more about that through the group and so on. In terms of law, what do I think? I mean, we could do so many things in Massachusetts, but I think one place to begin would be to begin doing what Wisconsin did. We already have an advisory committee to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education on law. I don't know who's on it. I chaired that for a while. I mean, we've connected to it for a while, but at least in the books, we have an institution that could do that. Or maybe it would be your group, or maybe it would be, maybe we should do this thing the way those high school students in Mexico solved the problem. They didn't wait for someone else to solve it. They said, let's do it. I think maybe we should take the Common Core and we should say, okay, how do we use the Common Core to develop curriculum that is global? How do we do what we did for the Avenue Schools for Massachusetts? And you get a bunch of people who care about these things to imagine what should a high school graduate from Massachusetts know about the facts about the world, care about, and be able to do, so they actually can be an empowered global citizen to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And so it's a really simple thing to do. We would begin with the goals, the 17 goals. We would study what they are, and then we would say, well, what's an appropriate, great appropriate way for a high school graduate to have the competencies and the dispositions to understand these things and do something about them. And once we're clear on that end, we would then go back, look at our Common Core, and say, okay, so how do we find a curriculum that helps us do that in the context of the things we have to teach? And I think we could do that, and I think we could do it in short order. I don't think it took us to do the Avenues curriculum, and we didn't have a Common Core, a year and a half to do that. And so I think we could do this in a few months if we set our minds to it. Yeah. You're trying to finish?
Yes. Fernando, thank you so much. As I started off, every time I see your presentation, it's different, it's relevant, it spurs ideas for us educators and our communities. It's so exciting to have you here. But I would like to invite everybody, there's going to be book signing opportunities, there's a lot of food to the cafeteria, really good food. So I would invite everybody to come and get some, because I know I'm going to have one of each. And we'll have opportunities to have informal conversations as well. So why don't we move to the cafeteria to the next part of this event?
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.